My sister Vanessa stepped into my mother's kitchen with an empty Target bag, placed it on the marble counter, and gave that familiar cutting smirk. "Oops," she said lightly. "I left Ellie at Target." She was dawdling again. My mother let out a sharp, delighted laugh. "Good. That child has been monopolizing your grandfather's affection far too long. Perhaps now she'll learn she is not the center of this family." At that moment, my 5-year-old daughter was standing alone at the South Park Target security desk, clutching a simple wooden picture frame, quietly asking the employee, "Did I do something wrong?" I closed the powder room door and made one single phone call to my grandfather. What my mother and sister could not possibly know was that my grandmother, in the final summer of her life, had already prepared for this precise betrayal. 30 minutes later, their composure shattered, and the reckoning that followed was only beginning. My name is Georgina Burke. I'm 34 years old. If you've ever witnessed your own blood turn against your child, like this video and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. This is Lineage of Lies. Before I take you back to that Saturday, you need to know about one person who wasn't in the kitchen, not in the Target, not in any room that mattered that day. She died 20 months ago. Her name was Beatrice Holloway, and she was my grandmother. She knew my mother. She knew my sister. She knew, in the kind of way that only women who've spent 60 years inside a family can know, what would eventually happen to my daughter. In the final summer of her life, she sat in her own kitchen and recorded 9 voicemails. She handed them to a man named Walter Petton. She told him when to deliver each one, and to never deliver them all unless the worst of the worst came true. I didn't know the voicemails existed. My mother didn't. My sister didn't. My grandfather knew. He carried that knowledge for 2 years and never let it show. The day my sister came back from Target without my daughter, voicemail number 7 left Walt safe. That's where the story turns. But it's not where it starts. Saturday, May 2, 2026. Charlotte, North Carolina. My daughter wore a daisy print dress because she decided 3 days earlier that Pop's birthday wishes should be opened in front of daisies. She was 5. Her name was Eleanor. We called her Ellie. I'm a widow. My husband, Reed, died 4 years ago, hit by an SUV while riding his bike home. After the funeral, my grandmother stayed for 4 days. She made eggs and watched me until I ate them. My mother stayed 22 minutes. She left because my sister Vanessa was, in her words, having a really hard time with a breakup. My mother, Diane, has spent my whole life calling me sturdy, which I learned from my grandmother was not a compliment but an assignment. My sister Vanessa is 2 years younger and has always been called fragile, which in our family means someone who doesn't have to grow up. She's never apologized for anything. She has, however, told people that I'm the difficult one. Before my grandmother died of breast cancer, she did 3 things that would reshape everything. First, Ellie began rubbing lavender lotion on her cold hands during Sunday visits, a ritual my grandmother loved. Second, my grandmother taught Ellie a sentence in a whisper: Pop's eyes work better when you sit on his left side. After the funeral, Ellie told him that, and my grandfather cried. Third, when my grandfather fell in his garage last December, Ellie, then 5, used the speed dial 911 button my grandmother had secretly set up on her GPS watch, a watch we'd laughed about. My daughter saved his life. That Christmas Eve, my grandfather raised a glass and said, to my favorite great-granddaughter, "She has my wife's hands and my wife's stubbornness about my left ear." My sister told my mother he shouldn't say things like that out loud. It wasn't fair to the rest of us. My mother agreed. They didn't know my grandmother had already seen all of it coming. On the morning of May 2nd, I drove Ellie to my mother's house for brunch. My father, a man who'd spent 40 years retreating to the porch to avoid my mother's cruelty, hugged Ellie and then disappeared to the den. My mother handed me a photo album I'd never seen. While I was looking at a picture of my grandmother holding me as a newborn, Vanessa bent down to Ellie. "Ellie Bug, want to come help me pick out a present for Pop? Just you and me, 30 minutes at Target. I'll let you pick whatever you want. Ellie looked at me. I should have said no. The album was open, my mother was watching, and Vanessa was smiling the smile she'd worn since childhood, the one that meant she'd already decided what would happen. I said, bring her straight back by noon. Vanessa said, of course. At 10:15 a.m., they left in my mother's Audi. My daughter waved at me through the rear window, holding her stuffed otter. I wouldn't see her again for almost 3 hours. By 12:38 p.m., the front door opened. Only one set of footsteps. My sister walked in with the empty Target bag, placed it on the counter, and smirked. Oops. I left Ellie at Target. She was dawdling again. My mother laughed, then said those words I'll hear every Mother's Day for the rest of my life, good. That child has been monopolizing your grandfather's affection far too long. Perhaps now she'll learn she is not the center of this family. My father, who'd been making a sandwich, set down the knife. He walked out to the patio and closed the screen door without a word. I walked to the powder room, locked the door, and called Target. A police officer answered. My daughter was safe. She was sitting at guest services with a juice box, holding a picture frame she'd picked for Pop Pop. Then I called my grandfather. He listened, asked 3 questions, and said, Walt will handle it. Drive to her, then come to me. I walked back into the kitchen. My mother and sister were eating fruit. I said, do not follow me. Do not call me. I will be in touch when I am in touch. I left, closing the door quietly, the way my grandmother used to close doors. Final. At Target, I knelt in front of Ellie. She looked up and said, I waited like Auntie said. Was that the game? I told her there was no game, only a mistake that was not hers. The officer gave me the timeline. Vanessa had abandoned her at 10:58 a.m. My daughter had been alone for 22 minutes before a team member found her. The police report listed the aunt's name, Vanessa Carrington. Not a charge, but a record. Forever. I drove Ellie to my grandfather's lake house. On the way, my grandfather called Walt, the attorney, and said, Vanessa abandoned the child. Diane laughed. The 7th letter is now in play. Walt drove to my mother's house. In his briefcase, he carried a burner phone with my grandmother's voicemails. At 1:42 p.m., Walt placed that phone on my mother's coffee table and pressed play. My grandmother's voice, thinner from medication but unmistakable, filled the room. Diane, Vanessa, if you are hearing this, you have endangered Ellie. I saw the pattern years before I died. I told Edmund to prepare. The papers are already signed. Then Walt played a second recording. My grandmother, in the last months when she could still move around the house, had started leaving her old iPhone recording in the kitchen, hoping to catch the casual cruelties her daughters-in-law thought no one heard. She caught one. Vanessa's voice from June of 2022, speaking on the phone, not knowing, if something happens to Georgina, or God forbid Ellie, Mom and I would inherit a real piece of this. That kid is just a problem standing between us and what is ours. My sister stopped crying the moment she heard her own voice. My mother whispered one word, Beatrice. That night, my grandfather told me the full story of the 9 voicemails, each triggered by a specific betrayal. I didn't hear a summary, he walked me through them like scenes. The first, the day of the funeral, my grandmother's voice telling him to install cameras, change codes, open a separate account. He did it within 60 days. None of us noticed. The second, the afternoon my mother suggested he tour a retirement home, just to look. He had the locks rekeyed that week. The fifth, when my mother told a cousin he was forgetting names, my grandfather drove himself to a neurologist, scored 28 out of 30 on a cognitive test, and fired the lawyer who was my mother's friend, retaining Walt formally. The sixth. The day my sister showed up at Ellie's elementary school trying to sign her out without permission. The receptionist turned her away and called my grandfather. He paid Walt a $10,000 retainer the next week to draft emergency documents. My mother and sister thought they were winning small victories. They'd been bleeding for 20 months and didn't know where the cut was. The final confrontation came on May 9th, a meeting at my grandfather's house. My mother arrived in a camel cardigan and large sunglasses. My sister wore the black dress she'd worn to my grandmother's funeral. My father came last, wearing a suit for the first time since that same funeral. Walt directed them to the dining table. My grandfather and I sat across from each other. My mother and sister were placed at the short ends. The head chair, my grandmother's chair, remained empty, a framed wedding photograph on the seat. My father looked at it, then walked out to the porch and sat facing the water. He did not return. Walt laid out the documents one by one. The trust amendments reducing their monthly distributions to 0 over 6 months. The termination of Vanessa's condo lease. The time-stamped license plate footage from Target, showing the Audi leaving at 10:58. A Starbucks receipt from that same morning, paid by Vanessa. The police report. The neurologist's letter. And finally, the statement of intent my grandmother had signed in her hospice bed. My mother placed one hand on the table. "Dad, I know I made mistakes, but this is too much. Can't we sit down without lawyers? Just family like we used to." My grandfather looked at the empty chair. "Diane, look at the chair." She looked. She cried for the first time in front of me since I was a child. Not at me, not at Ellie, but at a chair. My sister stood and walked into the hallway, back pressed to the wall. Ellie, playing with blocks in the next room, said in her ordinary 5-year-old voice, "Hi, Auntie." My sister could not answer. When it ended, my mother walked to the Audi without looking back. My sister paused for 3 full seconds, staring at the wooden picture frame on the bookshelf, the one Ellie had picked at Target. Then she got in the car. My father stayed on the porch, later calling a rideshare. He sent me a note that night, the first in years, signed simply, "Dad. I'm sorry I wasn't in the room." In the weeks that followed, I removed my mother and sister from every emergency list, changed every code and password. My father planted a magnolia tree in my mother's garden without asking her, and when she called to complain, I said, "I hope it grows." She hung up. Weeks later, on a Sunday morning, I brought Ellie to my grandfather's for breakfast. On the porch, next to his coffee, was a third cup. My father arrived unannounced with a bakery box. My grandfather nodded and said, "There's room." My father sat. For the first time in my adult life, I saw him smile at me on purpose. Inside, Ellie checked the jar of lavender lotion on the shelf beside the picture frame, making sure it was closed. She asked if she could refill it when it ran out. My grandfather said yes. My grandmother left 2 voicemails I will never hear. One for my daughter at 18. One for her when she has her own first child. That's the gift, a future I don't have to be in for my daughter to be safe in it. So if you've made it this far, sit with this. Check who's on your school pickup list. Check who has your door code. Check who can make decisions in your name. The most loving thing my grandmother ever did was prepare what she couldn't say out loud. I'm 34 years old. My daughter is 5. My grandmother is 20 months gone, and she's still the largest presence in our family, in every paper, recording, and signed line that matters. I'm Georgina Burke, and this has been Lineage of Lies. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, trust the ones who prepare, not the ones who perform.